So to give an update on our progress with this build, I've sewn these two compression straps to the back panel, which permanently attaches our lid. I did that with 3 rows of stitches for each compression straps and a bar tack on each end. The next thing I did was take 2 pieces of 1-inch webbing and 2 of these rectangular 1-inch rings, and I folded the 1-inch webbing around the ring and sewed each one to this piece of 2-inch webbing. These are spaced about 2 inches apart. These will provide attachment points for the removable shoulder straps. And I took this piece of 2-inch webbing. It's as long as the back panel, about 13 inches, and I sewed that to the back panel using 3 rows of stitches. I've also cut this piece of air mesh. It's about 12 inches by just a little bit longer than the back panel. I'll explain that in a second. But I've folded 2 pieces of 3/4 inch grosgrain ribbon around the top and bottom sides of that. I've already sewn the bottom to the actual back panel already. I've trimmed down a piece of polyvinyl foam that I salvaged from a stadium cushion that I tore apart. I think the dimensions of this were roughly about 11 1/4 by 11 3/4 is what I ended up with. This is going to be going in between the back panel and the air mesh to provide cushioning. Now I want to point out that originally the plan was to sew the air mesh and the cushioning to the back panel first, and then sew this piece of 2-inch webbing on top of the cushioning. But after thinking about it, I just decided it made more sense to sew the 2-inch webbing right to the back panel and have the cushioning over the top of that. As I stated, I left this air mesh a little bit longer than the actual back panel, and that's basically so that it has to wrap around the cushioning, so I needed a little bit of extra material there. And once I'm done sewing that in place, I'll just cut off the excess. My next step going forward is I'm going to sew a seam through this grosgrain ribbon, attaching this top part of the air mesh to the back panel, and then I'm going to slide the polyvinyl foam up underneath the air mesh, in between the air mesh and the back panel. And then I'll probably sew some seams to hold that in place along the sides, and I will probably sew through the polyvinyl foam. I'll basically sew some seams down the center and maybe from one side to the other, and that's basically just to provide sort of an air channel for extra airflow and help relieve some of the sweat you might get on your back. So it's now 1 day later, and I've finished sewing this mesh and the polyvinyl foam onto the back panel. I'm often pushing my sewing machine to do things that it's not meant to do, and I think I've pushed it a little bit too far this time. This polyvinyl foam is just way too thick to fit underneath the presser foot. There's just not enough clearance. I managed to sew some grooves into it anyway. To achieve that, I basically press down, I compress the polyvinyl foam and the 3D air mesh, wedged it up underneath the presser foot, and I was basically pushing the material through the machine as it was stitching. I'll say that the result did not turn out at all what I was hoping for. The stitching is very ugly, it's crooked, and I may have damaged my sewing machine in the process of doing this. I think it basically destroyed the tension on my sewing machine. I got to the point where adjusting the wheel on the top to adjust the tension had no effect. I literally had to take the machine apart and adjust the bobbin tension a little bit at a time. And I got it to the point where it's sewing again, but I literally had to turn the wheel all the way on the wheel on the top of the machine all the way to the highest tension setting, in addition to adjusting the bobbin tension. And it's sewing again, but I may need to just end up ordering a new bobbin case. So that being said, I wouldn't recommend doing padding this way. I'm sure there's an easier way to do it if you're using a domestic sewing machine. I'm sure a walking foot industrial sewing machine, it wouldn't even be an issue. But for a Singer 44S, I think it's just a step too far. I've debated just thread ripping everything, just seam ripping everything, and starting over with something more practical. But what's done is done, and I think I'm just going to move forward from here. But if you're doing a similar project, I don't recommend doing it this way. I would say find a thinner material rather than this very thick polyvinyl foam that I was working with, or just find a more practical way of doing it that doesn't involve sewing through such thick material.